preaching to Christians and non-Christians at the same time is surely a challenge. At the same time, it's interesting to have a brief historical perspective on this issue, because nowadays we tend to separate evangelistic preaching, that is preaching to non-believers, and preaching to believers, which in many of our circles will happen mostly in our gatherings or services, mostly on Sundays. That is, of course, important, and it should happen, particularly the preaching to non-believers in contexts where we don't have any believers, or we are doing a campaign or an initiative to reach out to those who do not believe yet. I can think of university campaigns or videos or other sorts of events that exist to reach out to non-believers. However, it's interesting to perhaps reconsider the possibility of using our gatherings to preach to both audiences at the same time. As I was saying, this is mostly how many of us view preaching. We either preach to non-believers or we preach to believers. But as we look back to the history of the church, it has not been like that always. For instance, we have a sermon from the early 2nd century, or one of the first written sermons that was delivered in the context of a Christian congregation. And it's very interesting to observe that that sermon was speaking to both Christians and non-Christians at the same time. That means that early from church life, the sermon in a Christian gathering was used to speak to both Christians and non-Christians. How come? There's an important thing to remember, and that is the gospel is necessary for our salvation and for regeneration, but the gospel is also necessary for our sanctification. And sometimes we embrace the preaching of the gospel to non-believers to see a change in their belief, but when we preach to Christians, we end up sometimes preaching a moralistic message. That means this is what we have to do. Work harder and do it. But we cannot do it. We need Jesus to live like Jesus wants us to live. Therefore, the gospel is both necessary for regeneration and sanctification. Therefore, others in church history, like the Puritans, would always preach Christ from any passage of scriptures to both audiences, Christians and non-Christians at the same time. And this dichotomy of separating only evangelistic preaching or only preaching to Christians was not something familiar to them. Many people in our day are rethinking that, and I find it especially useful in our European context, where very few people attend Christian gatherings. And many times that happens because our preaching is only focused in reaching to Christians. Non-Christians don't feel the sermon will be connecting to them. Therefore, I think it's wonderful to rethink and perhaps engage in this approach to preaching. That is, preaching to both non-Christians and Christians from the same sermon. I think it's possible, as I learned from many others, that we can be deep and we can really communicate the message of whatever passage from scriptures we are preaching from, understanding that God has revealed something of the gospel in those passages. And it's the preacher's task and calling to really understand what is God saying here. And what is God saying here to non-believers so that they may be saved? And what is God saying here to believers so that they may be sanctified by the work of the Spirit in union with Christ?